In this video, we're going to talk about the fundamentals of building a composite image. There are certain factors that you need to take into consideration in order to make sure that you are building a believable composite. Now, as we mentioned in the previous video, it's best to start with your background image. And the reason is that you can evaluate your background image for all of these factors that we're going to talk about, and then you can start bringing in your other images so that you can make sure that everything is going to match properly. So the first thing that you need to take into consideration is the lighting. And there's two things you need to look for. One is the quality of light, and the other is the direction of the light. So when we say quality of light, we're talking about hard light versus soft light. So I think most of us probably know what this means, but let's just really quickly review this idea. So let's take a look at this image. Now this image was shot with a hard lighting source, and you can tell because the shadows in this image are very sharp and very defined. So if we zoom in here, you can see that there's a very hard line along the edge of this shadow and a very hard transition between the shadow area and the highlight area of the face. Now if we look at another image, this image was shot with soft light. The lighting source itself is located pretty much exactly in the same position that the lighting source in the other image we looked at was. But now we have a soft box on this light. So we're getting a soft light, and you can see that the shadow under the subject's nose is much less defined. And if we zoom in here, you'll see that there's a much smoother transition between this shadow area and the highlight area on the subject's face. So that is essentially what we're talking about when we talk about hard light versus soft light. Now, let's take a look at our background image. So in this background image, we're mostly getting a soft light. Now this is an outdoor image, and if you are outdoors on a day with a totally blue sky, you're going to have hard light because the sun itself is definitely a hard lighting source. But as soon as we start to get clouds in the sky, the clouds act as a natural diffuser for that light, and now you have a soft lighting source. So in this image, we have a little bit of a combination, but it's mostly soft lighting because we have just a lot of clouds throughout this whole image. But you will note that on the left side of the frame here, where there is some blue sky sort of peeking through, that if you look at the water, you can see that there's a little bit more of some defined shadows falling underneath these sort of little ripples in the water that you don't see on the other side of the frame. And that's because some of that harder sunlight is kind of creeping in here. But overall, the image is mostly a nice soft lighting, so it'll be just fine for us to go ahead and use soft lighting sources to light our subjects for this image, or look for images which have soft lighting sources to bring into this background. Now, the other thing that you want to consider is the direction of the light. So looking at our image here, this image was shot at around midday, and I know that simply because I shot the image. It's a little trickier to tell in this image from just the shadows, though you can see by looking at the shadows that it is an overhead lighting source. And the main way that we can tell that is if we look at these clouds here, we have these really nice clouds kind of coming in from the side of the frame and sweeping across. Well, if we look directly below those clouds, we see that there's shadows from those clouds falling across the water. And those shadows really are falling directly beneath those clouds. So that tells us that our lighting source is fairly directly overhead. The other way that we can tell that in this particular image is because we are getting a little bit of shadow directly beneath these little ripples in the water. But this is a tiny bit trickier than maybe is great for an example. So let's look at some easier ones. So in this image, the first thing that you want to do is just look for where are the shadows falling in the image. So if we look here, we can see that the shadows are falling towards the right side of the frame. So that means that the lighting source is coming from the left side of the frame. Another thing that we'll note in this image is that the shadows are a little bit long. They're not super long, but they are a tiny bit long. So that means that the lighting source isn't too high in the sky. So we could say that maybe our sun is coming from somewhere around here in this image. Now, looking at another example, if we zoom in here, we can see that our shadows are falling towards the left side of our frame. And we can see that we have very, very long shadows. This is a tiny little rock, and it's casting this huge, long shadow. So that means that our lighting source is coming from the right side of the frame, and also that it's pretty low in our frame. So our sun is probably coming from maybe somewhere around here in this image. And we'll look at one last example. This one is a little bit harder to figure out, right? Because it almost looks like it doesn't have any shadows. And this is because this image was shot at midday with a totally blue sky. So we have a completely overhead lighting source on a totally blue sky, so there's no diffusion at all. It's just hard light coming directly from above. And if we zoom in, we'll note that the only shadows we're really seeing are falling directly underneath the objects in the frame. So we have these bushes here, and you can see some shadows directly beneath them. And if you look closely at the mountains in the background, you can see that there's some areas where there are some tiny shadows. But by and large, this is a very, very flat image. And when you shoot at midday, you are going to get a very flat lighting. So those are the things that we need to look at first. Now we've figured out our lighting for our image. We know that it's a soft light, and we know that we have a mostly overhead lighting source. Other things that you will need to take into consideration are perspective and angle. So perspective is essentially referring to how close or far away are we from various elements in our scene. And we will need to adjust the size of the elements in our scene based on their location within our frame. And then also angle. So angle and perspective are kind of related to each other, right? Because our perspective on an object is also related to the angle at which we are viewing it. So camera angle is what we're talking about here essentially in a composite photograph. So are we angling up on our scene, or are we angling down, or are we just looking at it straight on? And these are all things that we need to take into account when we start getting together the other elements that we're going to place into our background. So let's go ahead and take a look at our background here again. One thing that can be helpful for you is to find the horizon line in your background. So in this particular scene, it's actually going to be very easy because this is an oceanscape, so we can actually see the horizon. Now, if you don't have a background where it's quite as easy as this to find the horizon line, you can use other lines in the frame to help to guide you to the intersecting points, which will indicate where the horizon is located. Architecture can help with this because a lot of times an image with architectural lines will allow you to follow those lines to where they meet. So in this scene, our horizon line is right here. So very easy, we've got that figured out. Now, there's a couple things that tells us. This is going to help us with our placement of our subjects into our scene, but it also tells us about the camera angle. So when we're angling up on a scene, our horizon line will drop in our frame. When we're angling down on a scene, our horizon line will rise in our frame. So here we can see that our horizon line is a little bit below the center of the frame. So the center is probably maybe somewhere around here, and our horizon line is a bit lower. So that means that we are angling just slightly up. It's not some huge up angle. We're just slightly angling up on this scene so that we're getting more of the sky in our frame than we are the water. And this tells us that when we shoot our subjects for this image, we will probably likewise want to angle up just slightly on them. So that's something that we will take into our shoot for this image. So essentially, what is the takeaway from the evaluation that we've done here? So we know that we will be using a soft light on our subjects and that we want that light to be located overhead. We know that we will want to angle up on our subjects. And we know, and this is something that I just kind of do as a rule of thumb, I typically want to get my subjects as large as possible in my frame in order to give myself flexibility. So when I bring my subjects in here, I'm not really sure yet how large I'm going to want them to be. I know I want them to be in the foreground, so they're going to be pretty big, but I'm really not certain yet how large or how small, or where exactly they're going to be located in the frame. And because of that, I want to get the most resolution on my subjects as possible so that I can not have to worry about needing to blow them up. So you don't really want to bring images into your composite that you're going to have to blow up, because you're going to lose resolution on those images. You really want to make sure that you'll only have to shrink them down. So just as a rule of thumb, I typically will shoot my subjects and even my objects that I may be placing into my frame at as high of a resolution as I possibly can, which means that I want to crop in on them with my camera as tight as I possibly can. So those are the things that we are going to be taking into account as we move into the shoot, and we will be doing our shoot in the next video.